Welcome, my dear friends, to Midnight Murder, the place where the clocks slow down and the mysteries linger like cigar smoke in a country house library. I'm Edward Gray, and tonight we return to the little gray cells of the greatest detective who ever lived. Pour yourself something amber, dim the lights, and let us step back into 1927. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm, London, Monday the 17th of October, 1927, and the fog that night was the color of old bruises. It crept in from the river like a living thing, swallowing the gas lamps along the embankment, muffling the clop of hooves and the shout of newspaper boys until the whole city seemed to hold its breath. High above Lombard Street, in the private boardroom of the Grand Metropolitan Bank, 6 people prepared to decide the fate of £800,000, and though none of them yet knew it, the fate of one man's life. The room itself was a monument to money. Dark walnut paneling rose to a plaster ceiling heavy with acanthus leaves. A single long table, polished until it reflected the green silk shade of the banker's lamp, dominated the space. There were no windows that opened, only tall, narrow panes sealed since the day the building was finished in 1908. The air smelled faintly of cigars, beeswax, and the nervous sweat of men who had spent the day moving empires with a stroke of ink. At the head of the table sat Sir Reginald Hargreaves, senior partner, knight of the realm, terror of the city. He was 58, tall even when seated, with iron-gray hair brushed back from a forehead like a cliff. His evening clothes were faultless, but the skin beneath his eyes had the bruised look of a man who had not slept properly in months. In his right hand he turned a heavy gold pencil over and over as though it were a worry bead. To his right sat his wife, Lady Clarissa Hargreaves. 35 years old, ash-blonde hair coiled low on her neck, she wore midnight blue silk that caught what little light there was and threw it back like water. A triple string of pearls rested against skin so white it seemed almost translucent. She had been one of the great beauties of the 23 season. 10 years later the beauty remained, but something brittle had entered her eyes. She did not look at her husband. Across from her, rigid in a chair too small for his shoulders, sat Captain Marcus Trevelyan, late of the Coldstream Guards. Sunburn still darkened the skin above his white tie. The desert had marked him for life. His dress uniform had been exchanged for evening clothes, but the posture remained. Back straight, hands flat on thighs, the posture of a man who expected to be shot at any moment. He was 33, engaged to Sir Reginald's daughter from his first marriage, and rumored to be Lady Clarissa's lover. The rumor hung in the air like gun smoke. At the far end of the table, legs crossed, cigarette burning unnoticed in a long ebony holder, sat Miss Evelyn Hargreaves, Sir Reginald's only child by his first wife, dead these 15 years. 26, dark-haired and dressed with the severe elegance Paris had taught her, she looked like a blade wearing mourning. She had arrived from the Gare du Nord only that morning and still carried the faint scent of French tobacco in the Calais boat train. Her eyes, gray, cold, and far too intelligent, rested on her father with something that might have been contempt or pity. It was difficult to tell which. Mr. Percival Blaine, junior partner, occupied the chair nearest the door. He was 39, thin to the point of emaciation, and his evening clothes hung on him as though they belonged to a larger, more confident man. Gold-rimmed spectacles flashed whenever he moved his head, which was often. A small leather briefcase lay on the table in front of him, attached to his left wrist by a thin nickel chain and a handcuff that glinted dully in the lamplight. Inside, everyone in the room knew were bearer bonds to the value of £800,000, enough to buy a small country or ruin a large bank. And finally, in the chair to Sir Reginald's left, sat the stranger among them, Monsieur Félix Dumont of the Banque de Bruxelles. Small, impeccably tailored, with a moustache so symmetrical it might have been drawn with a set square, he looked like a doll placed among giants. His hands, gloved in pale gray kid, rested lightly on the table, and his eyes, dark, polite, and quite unreadable, moved from face to face as though memorizing a card game. Sir Reginald laid the gold pencil down with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud. "Tonight," he said, and his voice still carried the authority that had made grown men tremble in the city, "we end this sorry business once and for all." He did not look at his wife when he said it. "The Mediterranean Holdings loan has been mishandled. Certain signatures were obtained under false pretenses. Certain securities have proved to be," he permitted himself the ghost of a smile, "less substantial than was represented. The Banque de Bruxelles has sent Monsieur Dumont to satisfy itself that the Grand Metropolitan Bank remains solvent. I have agreed to transfer £800,000 in bearer bonds as collateral. In return, the bank will refrain from making public certain irregularities." Blaine's chain rattled as he shifted in his seat. "Furthermore," Sir Reginald continued, "certain personal matters will be laid to rest. Letters will be returned. Threats will be withdrawn. Am I understood?" Lady Clarissa's pearls clicked softly as she breathed in. Captain Trevelyan's hands curled into fists on his thighs. Evelyn Hargreaves exhaled a thin plume of smoke towards the ceiling. Only Monsieur Dumont remained perfectly still, the picture of continental detachment. Sir Reginald lifted a small silver bell and rang it once. The door opened, and the night porter, old Grayson, who had served the bank for 43 years, entered carrying a tray, 6 small glasses and a crystal decanter of crème de menthe, striking green against the dark wood. "Grayson will lock the outer doors at 9:15, Sir Reginald said. "After that we will not be disturbed." Grayson inclined his head, placed the tray in the center of the table, and withdrew. The door closed with the solid thud of oak and money. Percival Blaine rose, the chain of his briefcase chiming softly, and crossed to the door. He turned the brass knob of the Yale lock until it clicked home. The only key that could open it from the outside now rested in Sir Reginald's waistcoat pocket. Blaine returned to his seat. Sir Reginald poured the liqueur himself, 1 glass at a time, sliding each across the polished walnut with deliberate care. When all 6 glasses were filled, he raised his own. "To the future," he said, and this time he did look at his wife. "To honesty," Evelyn Hargreaves murmured so softly that only Dumont heard her. "To whatever comes," Captain Trevelyan said, and drank. Outside, somewhere far below in the canyon of Lombard Street, a clock began to strike 9. The green lamp glowed. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. And in the boardroom of the Grand Metropolitan Bank, 6 people drank to the future, none of them knowing that for one of them there would be no future at all. Chapter 2. The Crime Discovered. The fog lingered into the morning of Tuesday, the 18th of October, as though London itself were reluctant to wake and face what had happened in the night. Pale light filtered through the high windows of the Grand Metropolitan Bank, turning the marble floors the color of weak tea. The great brass doors stood closed, the clock above them ticking toward 8 with the solemn patience of money. Mr. Entwistle, head cashier for 29 years, arrived at 5 minutes past the hour, umbrella dripping, keys jangling on their heavy ring. He was a small, precise man with a mustache trimmed daily and a horror of untidiness. The sight that greeted him in Lombard Street stopped him in his tracks. The front doors were unlocked. Not merely ajar, but unlocked, the Yale latch thrown back as though someone had left in a hurry. Grayson, the night porter, was meticulous about locking up. This was wrong, deeply wrong. Entwistle stepped inside, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty hall. The silence pressed against his ears. No hum of typists, no clack of adding machines, no murmur of early clerks. Only the tick of the clock and the faint drip of his umbrella on the marble. He called out once, softly, "Grayson?" No answer. Up the wide staircase he went, past the portraits of long-dead chairmen whose eyes seemed to follow him with disapproval. On the third floor, the corridor stretched away, gas lamps still burning low from the night. The boardroom door stood open 6 inches, a thin blade of green light spilling across the carpet runner. Entwistle's heart began to pound. He pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The scene froze him where he stood. Sir Reginald Hargreaves sat at the head of the table exactly as he had the previous evening, upright, evening clothes immaculate, hands resting on the arms of his chair. But his eyes stared sightlessly at the green banker's lamp, and in the center of his forehead was a small, neat hole from which a single trickle of blood had dried like a dark tear. On the blotter before him lay a heavy service revolver, the barrel still pointing toward his chest. The smell of cordite hung faint but unmistakable beneath the beeswax and cigars. Around the table, the other 5 sat as though asleep after a long dinner party. Lady Clarissa's head rested on her folded arms, ash-blonde hair loosened from its coil, one pearl earring dangling against the polished wood. Her breathing was slow and even, her face pale but peaceful. Captain Trevelyan had slumped back in his chair, mouth slightly open, a faint snore escaping with each breath. His bow tie had come undone and hung like a wilted flower. Miss Evelyn Hargreaves was curled in the leather armchair by the fireplace, knees drawn up, the silk scarf she had worn as an evening wrap now draped across her eyes like a blindfold. One hand still clutched the long ebony cigarette holder, though the cigarette had burned to ash hours ago. Mr. Blaine sat bolt upright, head lolling forward, spectacles askew on his nose. The briefcase remained chained to his wrist, the nickel links glinting in the lamplight. And Monsieur Dumont sat neatly, hands folded in his lap, eyes closed, the picture of a man taking 40 winks after a satisfactory meal. Only the faintest rise and fall of his chest proved he lived. Entwistle tried to speak and found no voice. He backed away until his shoulders met the doorframe, then turned and ran, shoes clattering down the stairs, through the hall, and out into Lombard Street where the first clerks were arriving. His scream brought them running. By 8:30, the bank was chaos contained behind hastily drawn blinds. Constables stood at every entrance. Telephones rang without cease. Reporters gathered like crows at the railings, notebooks ready. Grayson, the night porter, was found in his basement room, fast asleep in his chair, a half-empty cup of cocoa cold beside him. He swore he had locked the outer doors at 9:15 as always and had seen nothing, heard nothing. Someone had slipped a little chloral hydrate into his cocoa, the police surgeon later confirmed, enough to keep him unconscious until morning. At 8:45, Inspector Japp arrived, red-faced and breathless, mackintosh buttoned to the throat. He had been pulled from his breakfast kippers by an urgent telephone call. One look at the boardroom and he knew this was beyond the ordinary. He sent a constable to the nearest telegraph office with a single message addressed to Whitehaven. Mansions. Impossible murder at Grand Metropolitan Bank. Locked room. Come at once. Japp. Upstairs, the police surgeon completed his preliminary examination. Death instantaneous, he announced. Single bullet to the brain fired from about 18 inches. Time of death between 10 last night and 2 this morning. The revolver is a Webley Mark 6, standard Army issue. He pointed to the initials engraved on the butt. MT Captain Trevelyan's pistol. Every glass on the table had contained creme de menthe laced with chloral hydrate, enough in each to fell a man twice their size. The decanter itself was clean. The drug had been added to the individual glasses after pouring. The door had been locked from the inside. The only external key remained in Sir Reginald's waistcoat pocket. The Yale mechanism showed no sign of tampering. The windows were sealed. There was no fireplace flue large enough for a cat, let alone a murderer. The ceiling was solid plaster, the floorboards beneath the carpet undisturbed. 5 people had been drugged into helplessness. One man had been shot with a gun that belonged to one of the sleepers, and the killer had vanished as completely as if the fog itself had swallowed him. By 10 o'clock, the boardroom was crowded with photographers' flash powder and fingerprint dust. Lady Clarissa was carried downstairs on a stretcher, still drowsy, murmuring her husband's name. Captain Trevelyan woke furious and bewildered, staring at his revolver as though it were a snake. Evelyn Hargreaves removed the scarf from her eyes and looked at her father's body without a flicker of emotion. Blaine clutched his briefcase and refused to speak until he had seen his solicitor. Dumont woke politely, asked for coffee, and expressed mild surprise at the entire affair. The bearer bonds, when the briefcase was finally opened under 3 witnesses, were all present. £800,000 neatly stacked, serial numbers in order. Nothing appeared amiss. Yet everything was amiss. Inspector Japp stood in the corridor, mopping his brow with a large handkerchief. "A locked room," he muttered to his sergeant. 5 drugged witnesses. A gun that walked in by itself, shot the governor, and walked out again. I've seen some rum ones, but this... He shook his head. "We need Poirot, and we need him yesterday." Outside, the fog began to lift a little, revealing the pale disk of the sun. Inside the Grand Metropolitan Bank, the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot were already stirring, though their owner still sat peacefully at his breakfast table, unaware that London had produced another puzzle worthy of his attention. Chapter 3. Investigation begins. At precisely 11 o'clock, the revolving doors of the Grand Metropolitan Bank spun once more, and admitted a small, immaculate figure wrapped in a fur-collared overcoat the color of dark chocolate. Hercule Poirot stepped into the marble hall as though he owned the place. Malacca cane tapping a measured rhythm, hat tilted at the exact angle that proclaimed the world must wait until he was ready. 2 constables straightened unconsciously. Even the reporters lowered their notebooks a fraction. Great men, Poirot often observed, are recognized by porters and policemen long before they are recognized by their peers. Inspector Japp strode forward, relief written across his scarlet face. "Thank heaven you're here, Mr. Poirot. I've got 5 sleeping beauties, 1 corpse, and a room that was locked tighter than the Bank of England vault. I'm out of my depth and sinking fast." Poirot raised one eyebrow. "Describe to me, mon cher Japp, this sinking, slowly, with order and method." Japp led him up the staircase, talking as they went. Poirot listened without interruption, eyes half closed, head cocked like a blackbird listening for worms. At the boardroom door he paused, inhaled once through the nose, and entered. The room had been photographed, dusted, measured, and mourned over for 3 hours, yet Poirot moved through it as though it were a stage still waiting for its principal actor. He examined the revolver first, lifted it with a silk handkerchief, sniffed the barrel, noted the single discharged. Only 3 words were visible in violet ink. Rendezvous, Gare du Nord, Mon Cœur. The handwriting was unmistakably French. Item 6. A tiny smear of crimson on the inside rim of Monsieur Dumont's liqueur glass. Rouge, theatrical quality, the sort used by actresses and occasionally by men who wish to appear paler than nature intended. Japp watched the collection grow with mounting despair. Half of these things point at the wife, half at the daughter, and the rouge points straight at the Belgian. The burnt bond screams robbery, the love letter screams jealous passion, and the violet cachou could belong to anyone. You've got too many clues, Mr. Poirot, not too few. Poirot gave a small, satisfied smile. Precisely, mon ami. When there are too many clues, one is in the presence not of confusion, but of a deliberate fog. Someone wishes us to see Z forest and miss Z trees entirely. He summoned the 5 survivors one by one to the managing director's office, a smaller room that smelled of cedar and old ledgers. Lady Clarissa arrived first, wrapped in black fox, eyes red-rimmed but steady. She admitted the affair with Marcus Trevelyan, admitted that Reginald had threatened divorce and ruin. She denied murder with a languid wave of her hand. Reginald kept chloral for his nerves, she said. If I had wished him dead, I should simply have doubled his bedtime dose. Why stage this circus? Chapter 4. Clues and Red Herrings. Poirot spent the next 48 hours inhabiting the bank the way a cat inhabits a creamery. Quietly, thoroughly, and with an air of proprietorship that made the staff tiptoe past him in the corridors. He had the boardroom to himself for hours at a time, pacing its length in soft, deliberate steps, now and then crouching to examine a scuff on the parquet or a faint fingerprint on the green glass shade of the banker's lamp. He sent constables scurrying for magnifying glasses, tape measures, and, to Jap's bemusement, a small tin of mustache wax, which he used to lift a single pale hair from the arm of Lady Clarissa's chair. By the end of the second day, the little Belgian had accumulated a small museum of objects on the late Sir Reginald's desk. Item 1. A corner of a 1,000-pound bearer bond, charred at the edges, rescued from the cold grate. The serial number ended in 447. None of the bonds in Blaine's briefcase bore that sequence. Item 2. A single violet cachou, half dissolved, stuck to the sole of Captain Trevelyan's left dress shoe. Lady Clarissa swore she loathed the scent of violets and had not carried cachous for years. Item 3, a faint circular stain on the blotter, exactly the diameter of the base of the creme de menthe decanter, but slightly off-center from where the decanter had stood all night. Someone, Poirot murmured, had moved it, then moved it back. Item 4, the Webley revolver itself. The barrel had been wiped clean of prints, but the cylinder contained 5 cartridges and 1 empty case. The empty case, when examined under strong light, showed the faintest trace of fresh oil. Someone had cleaned and reloaded the weapon within the last fortnight. Item 5. A torn scrap of pale blue notepaper wedged beneath the cushion of Evelyn Hargreaves' armchair. Only 3 words were visible in violet ink. Rendezvous, Gare du Nord, mon cœur. The handwriting was unmistakably French. Item 6. A tiny smear of crimson on the inside rim of Monsieur Dumont's liqueur glass. Rouge, theatrical quality, the sort used by actresses and, occasionally, by men who wished to appear paler than nature intended. Jap watched the collection grow with mounting despair. Half of these things point at the wife, half at the daughter, and the rouge points straight at the Belgian. The burnt bond screams robbery, the love letter screams jealous passion, and the violet cachou could belong to anyone. You've got too many clues, Mr. Poirot, not too few. Poirot gave a small, satisfied smile. Precisely, mon ami. When there are too many clues, one is in the presence not of confusion, but of a deliberate fog. Someone wishes us to see Zay Forest and miss Zay trees entirely. He summoned the 5 survivors, one by one, to the managing director's office, a smaller room that smelled of cedar and old ledgers. Lady Clarissa arrived first, wrapped in black fox, eyes red-rimmed but steady. She admitted the affair with Marcus Trevelyan, admitted that Reginald had threatened divorce and ruin. She denied murder with a languid wave of her hand. Reginald kept chloral for his nerves, she said. If I had wished him dead, I should simply have doubled his bedtime dose. Why stage this circus? Captain Trevelyan stormed in next, still in the same evening clothes, now rumpled and smelling faintly of brandy. He swore the revolver had been stolen from his flat weeks earlier. He had reported nothing because he feared it would be used in some scandal against Clarissa. His fists clenched and unclenched as he spoke. If I'd wanted the old man dead, I'd have called him out, not drugged myself senseless. Evelyn Hargreaves entered without knocking, cigarette already lit. She glanced at the charred bond corner and laughed softly. Father was cutting me out of everything because I refused to marry Percival Blaine. Did I hate him? Yes, Did I kill him? Don't be absurd. I was unconscious like the rest of you. She tapped ash onto the carpet. Besides, if I had arranged father's demise, I should have done it in Paris. The French police are so much more understanding about crimes passionals. Percival Blaine arrived clutching a fresh briefcase as though it were a life belt. He had spent the morning with his solicitor and smelled of fear. Small discrepancies in the ledgers. Nothing serious, a mere 20,000 here or there, had been discovered months ago. Sir Reginald had promised to deal with them privately. Blaine's fingers trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. I swear the bonds in that case were genuine when I locked them in. I checked twice. Last came Monsieur Félix Dumont, serene as ever, gloved hands folded across the head of his cane. He regretted the tragedy, of course. He had come only to verify securities. He had no interest in English family quarrels. When shown the smear of rouge, he permitted himself a delicate shrug. Many gentlemen in Brussels use a touch of color. The climate is unkind to the complexion. Poirot dismissed him with a bow so courteous it felt like a slap. That evening, in the fog-drenched street outside the bank, Poirot stood beneath a hissing gas lamp and arranged his little museum of clues in his mind like pieces on a chessboard. Someone had burned a bond that did not belong to the set. Someone had planted violet cachous and a love letter. Someone had cleaned a revolver and worn rouge. Someone had moved the decanter a fraction and then moved it back. Too many cooks, Poirot murmured to the fog, have spoiled this broth. But Hercule Poirot, he is about to taste it and tell you exactly which cook added the arsenic. Far above him in the darkened boardroom, the green banker's lamp still glowed like a malevolent eye, waiting for the next act. Chapter 5. Complications and Twists. On the morning of the third day, the case cracked open like a rotten walnut. Percival Blaine arrived at the bank pale as parchment, accompanied by 2 solemn directors and a representative of the Banque de Bruxelles. The briefcase was unlocked for the second time under the eyes of 4 witnesses. The bonds were laid out in neat stacks, serial numbers checked against the master list. Every single one was a forgery. Superb forgeries, paper, watermark, engraving flawless, but forgeries nonetheless. The genuine £800,000 had vanished as completely as the murderer. The Banque de Bruxelles issued an immediate demand for restitution. The city whispered that the Grand Metropolitan would not survive the week. Jap aged 10 years in an hour. By noon, the Evening Standard carried banner headlines. Banker murdered. 800,000 disappears in locked room. Beneath, in smaller type, Mystery Belgian under suspicion. That same afternoon, an anonymous letter reached Scotland Yard, typed on cheap paper that smelled faintly of violet cachous. The banker was killed by the one person physically incapable of firing the gun. The answer lies with the Belgian. Ask him why his father hanged himself in 1917. Poirot received an identical note, delivered by hand to Whitehaven Mansions. He read it twice, sniffed the paper and placed it carefully in his pocket with a soft, "Tiens." That night, as he left the Savoy Grill after a solitary dinner, a taxi mounted the curb in the Strand and tried to crush him against the wall. Poirot saved himself only by a nimble sideways leap that left him sprawled among the oyster shells outside Bentley's. The taxi roared away into the fog. The little Belgian rose, brushed shellfish from his overcoat, and looked remarkably pleased. "Someone," he told the startled commissionaire, "has read tomorrow's newspapers a little early. That is most instructive." The following morning brought a second shock. Captain Trevelyan's battalion records, hastily summoned from the War Office, revealed that his Webley revolver had been officially surrendered in 1919. The weapon on the table was an exact duplicate, same regimental markings, same notch on the butt where a Turkish bullet had struck at Gaza. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to obtain an identical gun. Evelyn Hargreaves, meanwhile, laughed outright when shown the torn French love letter. She produced the complete document from her handbag. A perfectly innocent note from a Parisian dressmaker confirming delivery of mourning gowns. The 3 visible words had been carefully chosen by tearing the paper at precisely the right spot. Lady Clarissa, under gentle pressure from Poirot, admitted that she had once been briefly engaged to a Belgian officer killed at Liège in 1914. She had kept one of his letters out of sentiment. The stationery was identical to the anonymous note. Piece by piece, the pretty mosaic of clues assembled in Chapter 4 dissolved into sand. Japp threw his hat on the floor and jumped on it. Poirot, far from discouraged, ordered hot chocolate and a plate of langue de chat and retired to the empty boardroom. He sat in Sir Reginald's chair, closed his eyes, and remained motionless for 3 hours while constables tiptoed past the door and Japp fumed in the corridor. At 6 o'clock he opened his eyes and announced to the astonished inspector, "Tomorrow night we return to the room where the crime occurred. Everyone who was present on the night of the murder will be there, including the dead man in a manner of speaking. The curtain, mon ami, is about to rise on the final act." Japp stared. "You know who did it?" "I know how it was done," Poirot corrected gently, "and very soon I shall know why. After that, the who becomes a mere formality." Outside, the fog had returned thicker than ever, swallowing the lights of Lombard Street until the bank seemed to float alone in a gray sea. Somewhere in that fog, the murderer was reading the evening papers, learning that the net was tightening and wondering which of his clever little touches had betrayed him. He would not have long to wonder. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The boardroom of the Grand Metropolitan Bank had never felt so small. At 9 o'clock on the 5th night after the murder, the same 6 chairs were occupied once more, though one occupant was represented only by a photograph in a silver frame placed where Sir Reginald had sat. The green banker's lamp cast its familiar pool of light. The same decanter of crème de menthe stood in the center of the table, unopened, the fog outside pressed against the windows like a living witness. Inspector Japp stood by the door with 2 large constables. Poirot, neat as a black cat, occupied the foot of the table. Lady Clarissa, Captain Trevelyan, Evelyn Hargreaves, Percival Blaine, and Monsieur Félix Dumont sat in their original places, pale, silent, waiting. Poirot began without preamble, his voice soft yet carrying to every corner. 5 nights ago, a man was shot in this room while 5 others slept the sleep of the drugged. The door was locked from the inside, the windows sealed. The revolver belonged to one of the sleepers, and £800,000 in bearer bonds disappeared. An impossible crime. And yet, as always, the impossible is simply that which one has not yet examined closely enough. He walked slowly around the table, gloved hands clasped behind his back. First, the drug. Chloral hydrate dissolved in crème de menthe was added to 5 glasses, but not the 6th. The murderer drank nothing or pretended to drink. A simple conjurer's sleight with a folded paper of crystals dropped into each glass as the sugar bowl was passed. Child's play for a man who once earned his living in the music halls of Montmartre under the name Armand the Astonishing. Monsieur Dumont's eyelids flickered, but he said nothing. Second, the revolver. Captain Trevelyan's own weapon, reported stolen weeks earlier. In fact, 2 weapons were prepared, the original cleaned and oiled, and an identical duplicate purchased on the black market in Brussels. Only one was needed, but duplicates are the mark of a careful man. Trevelyan half rose, face crimson. Poirot raised a placatory hand. "Patience, mon capitaine. You are innocent. That is why the duplicate was necessary." He turned to the table. Third, the locked door. Everyone assumed the Yale lock remained engaged from 9:22 until morning. But this type of lock has a small weakness. If the door is pulled very slightly inward as the snib is turned, the tongue does not fully enter the strike plate. From the outside, it appears locked. A thin blade, or a finger inserted through the letter slot directly beneath, can flip the snib back and open the door in perfect silence. The letter slot, alas, was removed during renovations in 1928 and is no longer here to betray the trick. But in October 1927 it was present and it was used. A collective intake of breath. Poirot lifted the charred corner of bearer bond. Fourth, the bonds. The genuine bonds were removed from Mr. Blaine's briefcase 2 weeks ago during a private visit to the bank after hours. Forgeries were substituted. The burnt scrap was torn from one of the genuine bonds and placed in the grate to suggest a hurried destruction that never took place. The real bonds traveled to Brussels in the diplomatic bag of a certain attaché who believed he was carrying architectural plans. He stopped behind Dumont's chair. And now we come to you, Monsieur Armand de Ville, for that is your true name. 10 years ago, Sir Reginald Hargreaves ruined your father in a fraudulent flotation. Your father hanged himself in a garret in Liège. You swore revenge. You forged an introduction from the Banque de Bruxelles. Child's play for a man who can forge £800,000 in securities, entered the bank and waited for your moment. Dumont's face had gone the color of old ash, but his voice remained steady. An elegant theory, Monsieur Poirot, but I was drugged with the others. My glass contained chloral like the rest. Poirot smiled, a small cat-like smile. No. Your glass contained only crème de menthe. The crimson smear on the rim is not blood. It is theatrical rouge. You applied it to the inside of the glass after pretending to drink, then pressed the rim to your lips to leave the mark. A clever touch to convince the police you had swallowed the drug. But rouge dissolves in alcohol. By morning it had spread exactly as genuine lipstick would if you had truly drunk. He produced a small glass vial from his pocket. This fell from your coat when you tried to run me down in the Strand. It contains the identical chloral hydrate used in the crime. Your fingerprints are on it, and the genuine bonds were recovered this afternoon from the left luggage office at Charing Cross in a suitcase bearing the initials F.D. For a long moment the room was utterly silent. Then Dumont moved with astonishing speed, overturning his chair, lunging for the door. The 2 constables caught him before he had taken 3 steps. Handcuffs clicked like a period at the end of a sentence. Lady Clarissa began to weep, softly, without sound. Captain Trevelyan stared at the table as though he had never seen wood before. Evelyn Hargreaves lit a cigarette with steady fingers and exhaled toward the ceiling. Poirot bowed slightly to the room. And that, mesdames et messieurs, is how one man avenged his father, stole a fortune, and very nearly committed the perfect crime. But perfection, alas, is not for mortals. Even the cleverest murderer leaves one thread loose, in this case a smear of rouge and a letter slot that no longer exists. He turned to Japp. Inspector, your prisoner. As Dumont was led away, still struggling, Poirot allowed himself the smallest of sighs. Revenge, he said quietly, is a dish that cools very quickly. By the time it is served, the taste is always ashes. The green lamp flickered once, as though in agreement, and the fog outside began, at last, to lift. Chapter 7. Justice served. 3 months later, on a raw January morning in 1928, the bells of St. Sepulchre without Newgate tolled 8 times across the slushy streets of the city. At 1 minute past the hour, Armand de Ville, once known as Félix Dumont, once known on the Brussels stage as Armand the Astonishing, dropped through the trap at Pentonville prison with a sound like a sack of wet cement hitting flagstones. The prison surgeon pronounced life extinct at 8:07. The greatest conjuring trick of his career had been performed for an audience of 1 hangman and 2 warders. and even they did not applaud. The newspapers gave him 3 columns on page 5, then turned their attention to the latest divorce of a minor duchess. The Grand Metropolitan Bank did not collapse after all. Evelyn Hargreaves, now sole proprietor under the terms of a will that no longer needed alteration, took her father's chair at the head of the board table and proved to have inherited every ounce of his ruthlessness and rather more of his financial genius. Within a year, the forged bonds affair was spoken of only in whispers, and within 2 years the bank had absorbed 2 smaller rivals and was spoken of with something approaching reverence. Evelyn never married. She kept a silver-framed photograph of her father on her desk, and beside it a small green banker's lamp that she never allowed anyone else to light. Lady Clarissa and Captain Trevelyan were married quietly at Caxton Hall 6 weeks after the trial ended. They sailed for Kenya the following day and bought a coffee plantation above the Ngong Hills. Rumor said they were happy. Rumor also said Clarissa kept a loaded service Webley in her bedside drawer and that Marcus still woke shouting from dreams of Gallipoli. Neither ever returned to England. Percival Blaine resigned the morning the jury delivered its verdict. He sold his house in Hampstead, bought a tiny second-hand bookshop in Chipping Campden, and spent the rest of his life surrounded by first editions and cats. Customers noticed that he always kept the door on a Yale lock and that he flinched whenever creme de menthe was mentioned. He died peacefully in 1959, leaving the shop and £12,000 to the Distressed Gentlewomen's Aid Society. Inspector Japp received a handsome pair of silver candlesticks from a grateful board of directors and a terse note from the commissioner congratulating him on not bungling the affair entirely. He placed the candlesticks on his mantelpiece and the note in his file marked "For future reference." And Hercule Poirot. He returned to Whitehaven Mansions on a cold February evening, dismissed George's anxious inquiries with a wave, and spent 2 full hours in his dressing room restoring his moustaches to their former glory with a new preparation from Paris. Only then did he permit himself a small glass of sirop de framboise in front of the fire. George, bringing the Evening Post, found his master staring into the flames with an expression almost of sadness. "Is anything the matter, sir?" Poirot sighed. "Justice is served, George, as always. The guilty is punished, the innocent go free, the money is restored. And yet—" He twirled the delicate stem of his glass. "And yet I find myself thinking of a boy in Liège who once watched his father hang from a beam because a London banker wanted another yacht. That boy waited 10 years, learned forgery and conjuring and hatred, and in the end became exactly the monster he set out to destroy. One wonders sometimes whether the little gray cells are always employed on the side of the angels." George, who had heard many strange things in that flat, waited respectfully. Poirot roused himself. "Bah, enough philosophy. Tomorrow I have promised myself a new tie, emerald green to match the lamp of memory. And next month, mon ami, we sail for Egypt. I have heard that the Nile in springtime is particularly restful to the nerves." He raised his glass to the firelight. "To order and method," he said softly, "and to the hope that next time the puzzle will be a little less tragic." Outside, a thin snow began to fall over London, covering the rooftops like a clean white page waiting for the next story. And in the quiet flat above the street, Hercule Poirot drank his raspberry syrup, listened to the silence, and allowed himself just this once a single small tear that no one would ever see. Chapter 8. Epilogue. The Lamp That Never Went Out. Years passed, as years will, with the quiet indifference of a banker balancing ledgers. The Great Depression came and went. The bank weathered it under Evelyn Hargreaves's iron hand. Kings abdicated, empires crumbled, another war scarred the sky above London, yet the boardroom on the 3rd floor of the Grand Metropolitan remained almost unchanged. The walnut paneling darkened with age and polish. The plaster ceiling acquired a faint crack shaped like a question mark, but the green banker's lamp stayed exactly where it had always been, wired now to electricity instead of gas, its shade a fraction more faded, its brass base rubbed smooth by generations of nervous fingers. Evelyn never allowed anyone else to switch it on or off. Every evening at 6, when the clerks had gone and the corridors fell silent, she climbed the 3 flights alone, key in hand, and entered the room that had once been her father's. She would sit in his old chair, light a cigarette, Turkish always in an ebony holder, and stare at the circle of green light on the blotter until the city outside dissolved into darkness. Sometimes she spoke aloud, softly, as though continuing a conversation begun in 1927. "You were wrong, father," she would say. "Money can be mended, reputations can be bought back. But people once broken stay broken." No one knew whether she spoke to Sir Reginald or to the ghost of the man who had killed him. In the autumn of 1953, a young Belgian journalist arrived in London researching a book on famous locked-room mysteries. He had read the newspaper reports of the banker's betrayal, yellowed now and brittle, and he wanted the room itself. Evelyn, 52 and still beautiful in the way a glacier is beautiful, received him in the boardroom at dusk. She turned on the green lamp herself. The journalist, tall, earnest, with a mustache almost as ambitious as Poirot's once had been, asked permission to measure the doorframe, to photograph the exact position of the chairs, to search for the legendary letter slot that had vanished in the 1928 renovations. Evelyn watched him with cool amusement. "You will find nothing," she said. Monsieur Poirot took the only real evidence with him when he left, a smear of rouge on a wine glass and a heart full of pity. The young man persisted. He had interviewed the retired hangman, the prison chaplain, even old Mr. Blaine in his Cotswold bookshop. He wanted the final piece, the room as it had been on the night of the murder. Evelyn stubbed out her cigarette on the very spot where her father's blood had once dried. "Very well," she said. "Close the door." He obeyed. The Yale lock clicked with the same decisive sound it had made 26 years earlier. She reached into the drawer of the big desk and drew out a small crystal vial, half full of colorless liquid. The journalist's eyes widened. He recognized the description. "Chloral hydrate," Evelyn said quietly. "I keep it to remind myself how easy it is to make people sleep, and how dangerous waking can be." She set the vial beneath the lamp. "Then when I was 26, I believed justice had been done. Now I'm not so sure. Armand Deville hanged, yes, but my father ruined a dozen men before breakfast and called it business. Where was their rope?" The journalist found he had no answer. Evelyn rose and walked to the window. Far below, traffic crawled along Lombard Street, red buses and black taxis moving like blood cells through the veins of the city. "Monsieur Poirot once told me," she said, "that every murderer is someone's child. I hated him for saying it. I hate him still because he was right." She turned back to the room, her face half in shadow. "Take your photographs, young man. Measure what you like, but understand this, the real mystery was never how a man escaped from a locked room. The real mystery is how any of us lives with what we have done, or what has been done to us once the door is opened and the lights come on." She switched off the green lamp. The room fell into darkness so complete that for a moment the journalist felt the old terror of that October night. When the overhead lights came on again, Evelyn Hargreaves was already at the door. She paused on the threshold. "The lamp will stay," she said. "It is paid for. Everything in this building is paid for one way or another." She left him alone with the echo of her footsteps and the faint smell of Turkish tobacco. Years later, when the book was published in Brussels and Paris, the final chapter contained only one sentence about the boardroom itself. "The room still waits, patient as guilt, beneath a green lamp that has never been allowed to go out. And somewhere, in a quiet flat above a London street that no longer exists under that name, an elderly Belgian gentleman with the most magnificent mustaches in Europe closed the book, laid it aside, and permitted himself the smallest of sighs. "Eh bien," Hercule Poirot murmured to the empty air. "Some cases they do not end with the verdict. Some cases they never end at all." He reached for his tisane, tasted raspberries and regret in equal measure, and turned off his own green bedside lamp for the last time. Outside, snow was falling again over London, soft and merciless, covering every old sin with the thinnest, cleanest of lies. Chapter 9. The letter that arrived too late in the spring of 1967. A plain envelope bearing a Belgian postmark was delivered by hand to the offices of Hargreaves & Co. in Lombard Street. No stamp, no return address, only the single word Evelyn typewritten on the front in faded purple ribbon. The commissionaire, a man who had served the bank since the coronation, carried it upstairs himself and laid it on the blotter beneath the green lamp that still burned every evening at 6. Evelyn Hargreaves was 66 now, hair the color of steel under a severe chignon, face carved into harder lines than ever. She slit the envelope with the same gold paper knife her father had used, drew out one sheet of thin airmail paper and read it without expression. "My dear Mademoiselle Hargreaves, if this reaches you, I shall be dead. I write from a clinic outside Lausanne where the mountains are kind and the nights are long. You will not remember my name. I was a nurse here when Monsieur Poirot spent his last weeks in this same building in 1975. He spoke often of the banker's betrayal, though never with triumph. On the morning he died, he asked me to post a letter he had, kept sealed for nearly 50 years. I promised. Only now, after my own illness, have I found the courage. He kept your father's case alive in his heart longer than any other. Not because the puzzle was difficult. He solved it in 4 days, but because the solution hurt him. He told me once, that poor boy Deville was more sinned against than sinning, yet the law is the law, n'est-ce pas? Inside this envelope you will find the original letter Armand Deville wrote to his father the night before he hanged himself in Liège in 1917. Monsieur Poirot obtained it from the Belgian police in 1928. He never showed it to anyone. He said some truths are too heavy for daylight. Read it or burn it as you choose. Either way, the green lamp has burned long enough. With respect, Marie-Claire Dessein, formerly Ward's sister, Clinique Valmont, Evelyn unfolded the second older sheet, cheap paper, ink faded to brown, handwriting that started neat and ended in despair. Father, they have taken everything. The house, the factory, even Mother's ring. Sir Reginald Hargreaves smiles in the newspapers while we starve. I am 15 and I understand now what men are. When I am grown, I will find him. I will make him feel what it is to lose the world in a single morning. Forgive me for what I must become. Your son, Armand Evelyn, read it 3 times. The room was perfectly silent except for the soft tick of the ormolu clock that had survived 2 wars and 1 bombing raid. She sat for a long while with the letter open beneath the green lamp, the same lamp that had watched her father die, watched Poirot unravel a life, watched her build an empire on the ruins. At last she reached for the heavy cut-glass ashtray, struck a match, and held the corner of the boy's letter to the flame. The paper caught reluctantly, curling black, the desperate childish scrawl vanishing word by word until only a fragment remained. What I must become. She let the last ash fall into the tray, ground it out with the same cold precision she brought to board meetings, and only then allowed herself one small, almost soundless exhale that might have been a sob or might have been relief. She locked the boardroom at 7:30 later than usual. In the corridor she met the night porter, grandson of old Grayson who had slept through the murder, and gave him the instruction she had never given before. "Jenkins," she said, "the green lamp in the old boardroom. Turn it off tonight for good." The young man hesitated. "Forever, Miss Hargreaves." "Forever is a banking term," she replied. "Tonight will do." She walked down the 3 flights without looking back. Behind her, the switch clicked, and for the first time in 40 years, the 3rd-floor windows showed only darkness. Outside, London was swinging. Miniskirts, beetles, demolition cranes tearing down the old city to make room for the new. Evelyn Hargreaves stepped into the back of her Rolls-Royce, closed the glass partition, and told the driver to take her home to the house in Chelsea she had never shared with anyone. In the pocket of her sable coat, the last ash of a boy's vow crumbled to nothing between gloved fingers. The following morning, the green lamp was removed, wrapped in felt and consigned to a storeroom in the basement where ledgers went to die. No one ever saw it again. And somewhere in the Swiss Alps, an old nurse closed a drawer on a promise kept, poured herself a small glass of kirsch, and toasted the memory of a small Belgian with the magnificent mustaches who had understood better than anyone that some rooms should finally be allowed to go dark. Chapter 10. The Final Accounting. On the last day of September 1976, 9 years after the green lamp was extinguished, the solicitors of Hargreaves & Co. gathered in the walnut-paneled room that had once been the boardroom to read the last will and testament of Evelyn Margaret Hargreaves, spinster of this parish. Deceased the previous Tuesday at the age of 75. She had died as she had lived, alone, upright in her chair at the Chelsea house, a half-written memorandum on the blotter, and a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. The doctor said heart failure. The housekeeper, who had been with her 30 years, said simply, "She decided it was time." The room was crowded. Junior partners who had never met her in life now sat in the same chairs where murder had once been done. A representative from the Banque de Bruxelles, now merged into something larger and faceless, occupied the seat once taken by Félix Dumont. Captain Trevelyan's eldest son, sunburnt and uncomfortable in London clothes, had flown in from Nairobi. Even old Percival Blaine, 87 and frail, had been wheeled in from his Cotswold nursing home, eyes bright behind thick spectacles. The senior partner cleared his throat and began. The financial bequests were brisk and unsurprising. Trusts for loyal staff, scholarships at the City of London School for Girls. Evelyn had always insisted on girls. A chair in moral philosophy at the LSE to trouble the consciences of future bankers. Then came the codicil, written in Evelyn's own angular hand and witnessed only 3 weeks before her death. To the descendants of Armand de Ville, wherever they may be, I leave the sum of £1,000,000 sterling to be held in trust until the youngest child of his bloodline reaches the age of 25. The capital is never to be touched for any other purpose. Let it stand as interest on a debt that can never fully be repaid. A rustle swept the room. The solicitor continued. Should no direct descendants be found within 10 years, the money is to endow a small home in Liège for the rehabilitation of those who have attempted to take their own lives because of financial ruin. It is to be called La Maison du Pardon. Percival Blaine began to weep silently, tears sliding down the grooves of his ancient cheeks. The final paragraph was read in absolute silence. I have kept the green lamp all these years wrapped in felt in the sub-basement. Let it be cleaned, rewired, and placed in the entrance hall of La Maison du Pardon if it is ever built. Let it burn there every night, not as a memorial to murder, but as a reminder that every ledger has 2 sides, and that some debts are written in blood and tears rather than ink. When you switch it on, remember that the past is never truly past until we have balanced the books honestly. The solicitor closed the document. There was no more. Afterwards, in the corridor, the Nairobi nephew found himself standing beside the wheelchair. "Mr. Blaine," he said awkwardly, "my mother asked me to bring you this." He held out a small parcel wrapped in faded blue paper. Blaine unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single violet cachou, dried and brittle after half a century. Blaine smiled, the first real smile anyone had seen from him in years. "She always said Clarissa kept one," he whispered, "for the taste of forgiveness." He placed it carefully in his waistcoat pocket next to his heart. 3 months later, on a gray December morning, the Green Banker's lamp was carried out of the sub-basement by 2 porters who had never heard the story. It traveled by train and ferry to Belgium, wrapped in the same felt that had muffled it for 50 years. La Maison du Pardon opened its doors in the spring of 1978 on the outskirts of Liège, a modest house with clean white curtains and a garden where lilies grew in summer. Every evening at dusk, the newest resident, whoever they might be, was given the honor of switching on the green lamp in the hallway. It cast the same pool of soft underwater light it had always cast, only now it fell on faces that had once stared into abysses and chosen, against all reason, to step back. And somewhere, in whatever place small Belgian detectives go when their little gray cells finally rest, Hercule Poirot looked down, twirled an impeccable mustache, and allowed himself the very smallest of satisfied smiles. The books at last were balanced, the lamp burned on, and in the quiet London street that had once been Whitehaven Mansions, a brass plaque now reads simply, "Here lived Hercule Poirot, who believed that even the darkest room could be illuminated by the truth. Order and method, mes amis, always order and method, and when possible a little mercy."